Man, by now you're probably feeling really proud of yourself for managing the light-dependent reactions. Well, just like a lot of things in biology, we're peeling back another layer now that we're confident with the first layer. This is video 9.3 about how the light-dependent reactions can run in two different ways: cyclic and non-cyclic photophosphorylation. This video will cover just this one unit goal, understanding why it's important to have two different modes of light-dependent reactions. The good news is that you know about half of this. You know about non-cyclic photophosphorylation already. It's what we've been talking about as just the light-dependent reactions. But at this point, it's good to review what photophosphorylation is, since it's probably the longest word that we've had this year. Remember that phosphorylation just means adding phosphates to something. And photo has to do with light. So all the information that you need is right there, because photophosphorylation is just the part of photosynthesis where ADP is phosphorylated to make ATP. So to recap this process of non-cyclic photophosphorylation, the reaction center chlorophyll in photosystem 2 steals electrons by splitting water. Light energy, or photons, absorbed by antenna pigments in photosystem 2 get passed to the reaction center pigment in photosystem 2. Then the reaction center pigment energizes the electrons from a low energy level to a high energy level. The high energy electrons are passed from one carrier to the next along the electron transport chain, building a proton gradient along the way. The proton gradient passes through ATP synthase to make ATP. Now, making this proton gradient takes away energy from the electrons, and now the electrons are at a lower energy level. So, photosystem 1 uses more light energy to re-energize these electrons. While the electron is still high energy up here, the electron is attached to NADP to make NADPH. To recap, non-cyclic phosphorylation causes two products to be made: ATP and NADPH. Cyclic photophosphorylation, on the other hand, just makes the proton gradient to make as much ATP as possible. When electrons are re-energized by photosystem 1, the high-energy electrons are just thrown back to previous carriers involved in making the proton gradient. Cyclic photophosphorylation just makes ATP and doesn't make NADPH. Why does this happen? Well, the second phase of photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle, needs more ATP, 18 per glucose, than NADPH, just 12 per glucose. Non-cyclic photophosphorylation, the regular light-dependent reactions, makes ATP and NADPH in a 1-to-1 ratio. But ATP and NADPH are needed in an 18-to-12 or 3-to-2 ratio. Cyclic photophosphorylation is just the ATP part of the light-dependent reactions working overtime to make up that difference that's needed. Well, let's compare these in a different way. Here's a diagram of the electron transport chain of photosynthesis. The non-cyclic light-dependent reactions charge the electrons twice, at photosystem 2 and at photosystem 1. After being charged up at photosystem 2, the high energy in the high energy electrons is used to make a proton gradient that's used to make ATP. After being charged up a second time, high energy electrons are used to make NADPH. Two energizing steps, two unique products. Let's compare that to the cyclic light-dependent reactions. There are still two excitations of electrons at photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. In cyclic photophosphorylation, however, the high-energy electrons, after being excited at photosystem 1, are cycled back to carriers that were used earlier on. This cycling of electrons causes more and more of a proton gradient to be made, and then more and more ATP to be made. It's important to realize that the mode of light-dependent reactions isn't one or the other. Cyclic and non-cyclic are happening at the same time. If there's an NADP to accept the electron at the end, NADPH is made. But since NADPH is used less than ATP in the Calvin cycle, a lot of times NADPH is going to be waiting for ATP so the Calvin cycle can go. When that's happening and NADPH is waiting around for the Calvin cycle for more ATP, cyclic photophosphorylation will be used to make more ATP. Learning about this blows our mind a little bit and forces us to rethink our light-dependent reactions. So, what are the reactants for these reactions? Still, regardless of cyclic or non-cyclic light-dependent reactions, water and light are the reactants. Where do these reactants come from? Well, water comes from the soil through the roots and uses the xylem to get to the leaves. Light comes from the sun, and light energy is captured by the chlorophyll and the photosystems of chloroplasts. What are the products? Well, this is where the difference is. The products of the light-dependent reactions, the non-cyclic version, are ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. The products for the cyclic mode of light-dependent reactions are just ATP and oxygen. Some oxygen will be used by the plant, but most of the oxygen will diffuse into the atmosphere. NADPH and ATP will be used to power the Calvin cycle. So remember, what's new about our thinking with this video is that more ATP is needed than NADPH. So plants run a mixture of cyclic and non-cyclic light-dependent reactions to meet this mixed need for ATP and NADPH. One last thing that I want you to remember, since we're thinking about this, is that water is the source of the electrons that get charged up by the photosystems, and water is the source of protons that's used for the proton gradient as well. I don't want you to lose perspective on where all this takes place. Remember, we're still talking about the light-dependent reactions here, even though we've attached some complicated wording to it. So, the main players are the electron transport chain and ATP synthase embedded in the thylakoid membrane in the thylakoids of a chloroplast. But think of everything else that's moving around during this process as well. Protons are high in the thylakoid space for two reasons. Water is being split in the thylakoid space, and protons are being pumped into the thylakoid space by chemiosmosis. The proton gradient collapses through ATP synthase, with protons flowing into the stroma through ATP synthase. ATP and NADPH are both made on the stroma side of the thylakoid. Here's a better picture to make sense of that overwhelming story. So, number one, check this out. Protons are pumped from the stroma on this side into the thylakoid space by the electron transport chain. More protons besides the one that are pumped are made when water is split by photolysis with photosystem 2. Protons from both of these sources move through ATP synthase from the thylakoid space back into the stroma by facilitated diffusion. ATP is made by photophosphorylation on the stromal side of ATP synthase. NADPH is made by a redox reaction at the end of this electron transport chain, where NADP is the final electron acceptor, making NADPH. And this makes sense, because NADPH and ATP are both used to power the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma. So let's recap. What we've learned here is that the light-dependent reactions are run in a mixture of two different modes, cyclic and non-cyclic photophosphorylation. Non-cyclic photophosphorylation is kind of like the conventional light-dependent reactions that make ATP and NADPH in a 1-to-1 ratio. Cyclic photophosphorylation is needed to make up for the gap in ATP. Cyclic photophosphorylation makes only ATP. This is important because the Calvin cycle needs more ATP than NADPH to make glucose. The products of the light-dependent reactions are made on the stromal side of the thylakoid membrane, and that makes it easy for the enzymes of the Calvin cycle to access these important high-energy products. Our next video will tackle the Calvin cycle.